that I fell in love with when I was working there and endeavored to find my way back there. And so the project that I want to talk to you guys about today is how I did that with some colleagues through a project that we recently had funded a year ago and just got done with the first, brilliant, full research season or field campaign. So the title of the talk is representative of the project itself, Land System Dynamics, looking at vulnerability and adaptation in a Transfrontier conservation area. The talk today is going to cover sort of a broad brush introduction of who's part of this project, what this project is focused on, what our objective is, how we are planning to achieve it, the kind of data that we collected in our first field campaign that wrapped up this past June, and how we're moving forward with one aspect of quantifying our understanding of this system in terms of thinking about vulnerability and specifically thinking about household vulnerability. And I'm happy to take questions throughout the talk or at the end or whatever you guys whatever floats your boat. This is a picture of the Chobe floodplain. So the area in Southern Africa that I'm going to be focused on is in Botswana and Namibia, part of this larger Transfrontier area that I'll introduce in a minute. This talk, I'm the one giving it, but it is definitely a collaborative effort, like I mentioned before. Two of the grad students that are affiliated with the project are actually here, Nick and Ariel. You're welcome to bombard them with questions. You're welcome to ask them straight to their face what their research questions are and see how well they can dance on their feet. But they both have, their parts of the project are tied into the remote sensing part, which I'm going to talk quite a bit about on the back end of this. But the project is a collaboration across these 3 U.S. institutions, as well as African institutions and African colleagues. Specifically, Lynn Cassidy, she is used to be affiliated with the University of Botswana with the Okavango Research Institute. She is now an independent environmental consultant. Joel Harder, he is the Director of Environmental Studies at CU Boulder, leading up the social team of the group. Narcisa Procope is at UNC Wilmington. She is part of the biophysical team, helping lead the analysis in land use land cover change. John Salerno is a postdoc with Joel at CU Boulder, human ecologist, tremendous asset in terms of thinking about livelihoods on the ground and how that relates to modeling the system. Forrest Stevens is a professor at U of L with me, our statistician / modeler on the team who can speak to all aspects of the project. And then so Ariel and Nick, Amelia, Steele, Michael are all various graduate students at different institutions working under the umbrella of the larger project. There are also colleagues in and on the ground at institutions in Botswana, Namibia, Zambia that are working with us as part of this project. And so what are we doing? What is this project? What is our objective? So the overall research objective, so the intent of this project is to facilitate this broader understanding of how livelihoods in this region are related to how land use activities and land use decisions sort of manifest on the environment and how the environment itself influences those livelihoods and land use decisions. And this is within the context of a transboundary area. That transboundary area is known as the Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area. It's the largest terrestrial conservation area in the world. It was, I think, official in 2014. This is just a rough figure using some gridded precipitation data to give you an idea of the precipitation regime, mean annual rainfall, ranging from very low down in here toward Kalahari Desert in Botswana, upwards to the northern areas where you're going to get much higher mean annual rainfall. The area that we're sort of focusing in is this central region, some of the major national parks, which are not reflective of all the different types of protected areas. I'll give you a map that overwhelms you with that in a minute. But does give you a little bit of indication. What we are interested in is communities in these different countries as it related to some of these major protected areas in terms of those livelihoods. And then that's sort of the bigger picture general precipitation. Seasonally, this is a bimodal system. So the rainy season is October to March or so, maybe a little into April. This is the intertropical convergence zone, just showing you that shift in the seasonality of the rains depending on where the ITCZ is located latitudinally. And so it's I'm sorry, I should have a scale on there. It's the blue and yellow. The blue is your highest intensity rainfall. And yes, the yellow is some range of precipitation less than that. The system is dominated by rain-fed subsistence agriculture in terms of livelihoods, which is why this matters. So the timing of the rain, the frequency of the rain, the duration of the rain matters. It also matters ecologically. So this is just to give you a little bit of a picture of what you're actually looking at on the landscape. The gray picture in the background is the Zambezi River, which cuts kind of centrally through north to south-ish through the Transfrontier area. In the lower rain-fed area, so it's all savanna, so a gradient of tree, grass, shrub, some kind of ratio of that is going to be dictated by soil nutrients, by fire, by herbivory, by precipitation, which is going to be the underlying driving factor. And so as you increase in your rainfall, that type of landscape is going to shift in terms of that woody grass or woody herbaceous proportions. Again, mitigated by these other varying drivers that can influence it. And that's really important because this system, people are highly reliant on the type of resources that you can extract. And those resources change, obviously, depending on what that proportion of woody the grass is. So the last sort of slide to sort of give you some context and to give you, make it a little more situational specific to what I'm about to talk about, is the system itself. So this is a beautiful area of Africa. So when you think about African safaris and you think about, you know, that once in a lifetime opportunity that people want to take to go see Africa, this is one of those areas that people think about going to. The photography tourism is huge. So like I mentioned before, the Okavango is there. Chobe National Park is an incredibly popular tourist destination because all the animals congregate on the Chobe River. It's a very beautiful place. Victoria Falls is part of this Transfrontier area. It's also just spitting distance from these other types of tourist areas. And it's also a huge hunting area, right? So this is 3 of the 5 big game in Southern Africa: elephants, leopard, buffalo. And so hunting is a huge incentive for certain countries. Some countries, like Botswana, recently have banned hunting. Namibia and Zambia is still big components. Zimbabwe. But juxtaposed between these and the conservation initiatives for sustaining and maintaining both the ecological and wildlife components of the system are the people, right? So this system has people live here, and people are trying to make a living, and people are trying to find their place, find that balance between, you know, the growing and the interest in the sort of that conservation dynamic of the system, but also you have this local livelihood component where people are very much tied to the resources on the ground. This is rural Africa, and the top-down type of policy implementations that are imposed related to conservation initiatives for tourism development can have really negative impacts on communities in this area. And that's not necessarily gone unnoticed. There's been a lot of efforts on the ground in terms of filtering funds from tourism to communities, and that's a whole nother thing to talk about. But just recognition that you have these different actors at play in terms of how the system operates is really important to understanding how livelihoods exist in this part of the world and the type of interactions and daily decision making that people are constantly having to think about, right? Because you have these really, these megafauna that are really vibrant symbols of this type of landscape, but that are also very efficient crop raiders who are going to come in and they're going to just totally wipe out your entire yield for a season in terms of the food production. So our overall research approach and what we're interested in doing is, can we figure out how to identify these levers to be able to facilitate or identify how this system works using a conceptual framework that we can then say, okay, these lever points are tied to understanding these types of changes in land use activities or land cover dynamics that then is going to affect vulnerability at the household level. So that's cool. Maybe that resonates. Maybe that's like whatever. But how do you do that? How are you thinking about approaching that? All right. And so so to do that, we had a framework. And myself and colleagues, we've thought a lot about this in terms of trying to understand vulnerability in the system. Our interest in understanding that vulnerability at the household level as it's related to these environmental changes on the landscape that could be tied to land use activities. And so this conceptual model here is just showing you the beginnings of a structural equation model that looks at the structural component of that statistical framework. And so you're looking at these constructs of vulnerability, exposure, adaptive capacity, and sensitivity. So when we think about vulnerability in the system, we can think about the vulnerability of these households as they're exposed to different environmental characteristics, the ability of that household to adapt to that environmental variability, and how sensitive that household is to being exposed to whatever that variability is. So that's pretty easy to say. You can look at that and you can talk about that at the conceptual level for a long time. You can talk about the direct paths that exposure might influence vulnerability of a household, or how the adaptive capacity might be correlated to vulnerability at the household level. Or maybe there's indirect paths shown by the dotted lines where exposure is going to somehow influence the sensitivity that then is related to vulnerability of the household, right? So there's these indirect or direct pathways that exposure, adaptive capacity, and sensitivity drive vulnerability at the household level. And this is one type of theoretical framing for understanding vulnerability, and is also very important in terms of the construct of this model. And that, hopefully that description allows you to understand the way we are thinking about understanding vulnerability, right? Where we want to understand it related to environmental change. We want to understand it in terms of the household's ability to adapt to that change. And we want to understand it as it relates to the sensitivity of that household to adapt to that change. And we think that all three of these things are important to understanding household vulnerability. But all four constructs are, you can't measure them. They're not directly measurable in the system. How do you measure vulnerability, right? And so what we have to do is we have to come up with these indicators that we think strongly represent what these latent constructs are in our system of interest. And so what these boxes here are showing you is these measured indicators that we can go out on the ground or through various data sources to collect measured data that can tell us something about that latent construct of, for example, adaptive capacity, or that latent construct of vulnerability. So for example, at the household level, maybe one of these boxes represents mortality. And so, or maybe one of these boxes represents information about food security at that household level. Those are things that we can actually measure that we can then use to inform our understanding of that latent variable of vulnerability. And so this is sort of the linkage between understanding like theorizing about what vulnerability is, and then putting it into practice in terms of understanding how vulnerability manifests at the household level in this Transfrontier conservation area. And so what I would like to do is just show you a little bit or briefly highlight some of the data and the way that we went about collecting the data, and then talk specifically about some of the data that is informing the exposure term. And then potentially I finish before the seminar time is finished to open up questions, which I would love to have questions, because this framing in our approach is something that I think I feel very strongly about, but I also think that there are lots of ways to conceive of it, and would love to have a dialogue if people want. So this figure here, there is you might soon see a rendition of it in American Scientist. There is an article that's going to be coming out in that journal very soon. And what this is depicting in red is the outline of CASA, so the boundary of CASA. And then in the various shades of green, what you see are these different levels of land tenure or governance, all right? So you have community conservation, you have commercial wildlife management, forest reserve, national park, wildlife reserve. And what should jump out at you when you look at this is there's a lot going on. There are a lot of designated areas for these various types of land tenure. And nestled within the middle of all this, the Chobe Enclave and Machi Conservancy are the two community areas where we spent the majority of our time this field season collecting household data. These two areas represent, how many of you guys have heard of community-based natural resource management? It's totally cool if you haven't, and just don't want to go throw around jargon that is gonna not resonate. So community-based natural resource management is a type of governance that was developed in Southern Africa to provide accountability and transparency all the way down to the local level with regards to wildlife and conservation efforts. And so CBNRM was a mechanism that would allow local people to take ownership of the wildlife and of the resources in their area, so that it wasn't just being imposed upon in terms of, no, you can't go hunt these animals, or no, you can't, go and collect resources in these areas because of the conservation efforts. And so the way that the sampling design, the way that this study was built, was to identify comparable community-based organization areas across various countries so that we could then look at state-level effects in that statistical framework. And so Machi Conservancy and the Chobe Enclave represent two types of community-based organization areas. So it's a defined area on the ground where all the villages in that area are part of this CBO bound. It doesn't mean that every person in that area has to be a member of the CBO, but it is a spatial unit of analysis in terms of defining a community area on the landscape. The Conservancy is it's not a district, but you could think of it at the district level. It has multiple villages in it. No, they're all part of the main one. And so different countries came up with their own system and approach for doing this. In Namibia, they're called conservancies, and there's a set of 6 or 7 things or rules that they have to go agree upon before gazetting that particular area as a conservancy. But then that conservancy then has the legal structure to negotiate and communicate and engage in the tourism sector, in the hunting sector, for facilitating those paths of funds with different people. Varies by country, and it varies by village. So a village could be as small as maybe 20 households, or it could be as large as 500. I mean, it's variable. And it depends on the country. So the sampling framework, I don't have all the details up here, and to be completely candid, I'd have to go back and look at exactly how the sampling frame was done for the social data. But the households, for Mashi and for Chobe, they both in sect, which is the same. If I have a CECT acronym, it's the same thing as Chobe Enclave. These two areas, these two community areas, have 5 village areas within it. And so within those 5 different village areas, these surveys, there was a sampling protocol that was developed to identify what was a household versus what was not a household. And then the surveys were designed to measure these different livelihood capitals that capture information about the activities of that individual household. And these different capitals, these are measures that would then inform our latent constructs of adaptive capacity and sensitivity. So the household survey was designed specifically with and vulnerability, with specific questions to be able to then inform that model in terms of that information. The surveys took around took less than an hour, and we did 240 surveys per community area. And the goal for next year, 2018, is to this light green area up here. It's huge, but it is the equivalent governance structure as what Mashi Conservancy and Chobe Enclave are. It's called a game management area in Zambia. And so we're currently figuring out the sampling scheme and the appropriate approach to sample communities in this GMA in Zambia for comparison to the data that was collected in Botswana and Namibia. So there'll be 3 countries within this Transfrontier area with with data at the household level to inform our understanding of vulnerability. Probably the head of the household. That's something that the data will be able to tell us because that kind of information was collected. I don't know that answer off the top of my head, and you were only with the Namibian group, right? Yeah. So I wouldn't designate to say, but if the head of the household was a female, then that was the person who was interviewed. There is a social team that I will not necessarily say that I'm part of, but that was very strategic in the way that the survey was designed and the way that it was implemented. And so this slide here was my chance to sort of articulate that on some level. So John and Lynn, Lynn is the environmental consultant from Botswana. John is done a lot of livelihood work in Tanzania. Those two basically coordinated with Joel in terms of we worked with local enumerators. So we worked in collaboration with people from the community areas, and they spent some time training these folks with regards to the survey and the approach of how the survey should be administered. And so that's what some of these figures are illustrating. This is actually a picture from Zambia. Joel and myself traveled here because the big field campaign that just happened this year, in 2016, the whole team went for introductions to the region. And so we went to the different communities, introduced ourselves, introduced the project, introduced what we wanted to do, got permissions and that kind of thing. And so Joel and I were doing that in Zambia this year, while the rest of the team had sort of rolled out the big effort with the research. And we went back and forth as a team. The more technical, well, I won't say that. We went back and forth with the team, but eventually it was decided that those that were in charge were more comfortable having paper surveys. So they decided to do the paper surveys for various reasons. They came up with their own protocol for sampling the households, like I mentioned before. And then they divided up in teams with a head coordinator person to oversee the enumerators and the process each day and make sure that everything was working as it should be going. It was a pretty intensive process, and they were tremendous, and they did a brilliant job with getting the data collected in a very short time with strapped on the financial side. But the background figure here is just showing you a typical type of village in terms of the building structures, building materials for the different houses. And it ranged. Some of the houses had cement, some of the houses had tin roofs, right? So this is going to be on one of the extremes, but not an outlier, right? So, oh, I forgot to preface the fact that we sort of had three components we're interested in: the household surveys, the biophysical side, but then we were really interested in the resource mapping. And so when we went initially to the region in 2016, we had some focus group discussions, and we talked to folks about what we were interested in figuring out is whether we could do maps with the household data. Because again, just to reiterate, our interest, our overall objective is to link household vulnerability to land use activities and land cover dynamics, which means we have to know where households are engaging in land use activities on the ground. And so we spent some time figuring out how this could work in terms of talking to at the household level with individuals about where they're actually collecting resources or engaging in land use activities on the landscape. And this figure here, this is Mashi Conservancy. This is the one in Namibia. The red outline is just showing you the boundaries. It's a Google Earth underneath, so you can see the areas with the white splotches represent settlement and agriculture, and the linear features represent roads. And then we have, this is an effort at trying to show the resource areas based on the focus group discussion level that we had in 2014. And long story short is this effort led to our conclusion that it wasn't going to work to try to do the mapping at the household level with individuals during the survey. And so what we wound up doing is the PhD student on the project is leading this effort, and he engaged in doing some resource mapping with individuals at household after the survey had been completed. So going back and meeting with households and having them actually take him out onto the landscape to map out these different areas where resources are being done. And this is all very new and very like in the process of analysis. But you can just already tell there's a difference in the level of detail and the level of information that you get between a focus group discussion and engaging at that household level. And this is just an example of how you can overlay those different polygons of resource use. This is a rapid eye satellite image, 5-meter resolution. normalized difference vegetation index. So green areas represent higher vegetation, greener parts of the landscape for different areas. There's a lot of variability going on there. And there's a lot of, I can tell you, knowing what the landscape is like, understanding, you know, that the really low NDVI values over here relates to agricultural plots, so on and so forth. But this component of the project has the potential to be really important in terms of linking between that household data and what I'm going to talk about next, which is the biophysical component. So there's another team, and this team is the one I was part of, that came in after the household data surveys were mostly being wrapped up. And this team was in the field to collect information on the ground about vegetation structure and productivity. We had another set of, or another protocol designed in terms of how this was approached. SciPec training sample is a form that I think there's probably a decent number of remote sensors out there that might be familiar with. It was developed at Indiana University, and it was a way of collecting land cover information on the ground specific to an area. So we adapted that form for our purposes. We did a stratified random method that allowed us to, what we were interested in is a land use intensity gradient away from community areas, and making sure that we sampled across that land use intensity with this idea that resource extraction and resource use was going to vary across that space. And then we did these transects on the ground that included taking GPS points and photo points of ground cover, along with flying unmanned aerial systems, aka drones. And so we had ground cover information from our transect, as well as the general reference sample training point that you do with remote sensing data. And then we were flying the drones for these different reference points. And so this type of, that process, there was a lot leading up to it in terms of permissions, both at the state level and at the local level, and making sure that we sort of had all our ducks in a row about what we needed, regulations and permissions for flying the drones. But we wound up flying 2 DJI Mavics. Does anybody use drones in their work here? Anybody ever flown a drone? Okay. So the Mavic, what's really nice about this type of drone versus a fixed wing is that it can move in tight, small areas. And so what we did is we got the Parrot Sequoia sensor, so the Mavic has its own sensor, which is right here. And then we bought another sensor, which is actually highly touted in the agricultural industry for mapping crop fields and measuring the health of crops. But we configured a way of strapping it, attaching it to the bottom of the Mavic. It has a sunshine sensor that goes on the top that corrects for illumination effects. And we basically the platform was able to handle that load so that we could still map, keep the drone up in the air long enough to do about 200 by 200 meter extent flights. And so we were doing that. We're using georeferencing that's tied to the GPS unit that's in the Sequoia. We flew at 100 meter altitude, and we did this for approximately 60 samples across that conservancy area in Mashi. A lot of this, we had a lot of introductions and a lot of curiosity, naturally, with this type of technology, and so spent some time visiting. There's a traditional authority structure at the local scale in terms of leadership in these communities, and so meeting with the local headmen and then Dunas, introducing the technology, introducing why we wanted to fly it, what we were doing with it, was factored into the time spent on the ground. And there was also field testing. So this was interesting, right? Because we're halfway around the world. We have a limited amount of time doing a new type of technology, trying to get everything systematic, standardized. But I think that the field team did a great job and came away with some really solid data from this. And so what I want to do is just return back to this modeling construct for a minute and talk about the exposure construct. So each of those constructs has to be measured somehow on the ground. You need data to inform the model. And so when thinking about exposure, what are you exposed to? What in terms of household vulnerability, you're exposed to what? And so our overall, and I'm going to answer that in a second. So the overall objective, quantify exposure-related aspects of vegetation productivity as it intersects with land uses. Because what are you exposed to? You're exposed to these changes and variability on the landscape and understanding how land cover is actually changing over space over time. Specifically, what we want to know is what is the best multi-scale remote sensing modeling approach that we can employ that allows us to estimate deviations from expected vegetation productivity or expected vegetation structure. Because it has to be something that you can measure that exposure can predict in that SEM structure. So deviations from the expected is something that potentially can inform what exposure represents in our model. So expected vegetation and productivity, expected vegetation structure. That leads hopefully to a question in your head. Deviations from what? So if you're looking at a quote unquote degraded land, what is degradation? That's a huge concept in my world related to savannas and discussion of savanna vegetation that maybe resonates in various fields that is represented in this room. But land degradation is this negative change in the spatial temporal patterns of vegetation, both with regards to the productivity, but also with the structure. So vegetation can green up and green down. Vegetation can have a certain level of quote unquote health, but structure is incredibly important too, especially in a system where you have animals that are large enough to suppress, like elephants, the structure of woody vegetation and literally transform it from woodland into a shrubland because those trees are never able to fully grow. And so when we talk about degradation in this Southern African savanna context, we're often talking about either bush encroachment or this deterioration in the biological productivity of the landscape relative to livestock or wildlife. But we can get at a measure of this through the remote sensing or through various remote sensing data. So one of the really interesting questions to me and to sort of the larger team as a whole is understanding the scaling relationships and the ability to take information at a really high spatial fidelity and link it across lower levels of spatial fidelity, but with satellite products that have high temporal fidelity, right? So there's always these trade-offs with remote sensing products between spatial, temporal, and to certain degrees radiometric and spectral resolutions. And I was trying to gauge the level of the knowledge base with remote sensing in the audience, but just very quickly, each satellite image is a raster, and that raster is comprised of a whole bunch of grid cells or pixels. And each pixel, which is represented here in these columns and rows, represents a value that is reminiscent of some characteristic on the landscape. And so this is that area in Mashi. The yellow box is all these pixels here. The linear feature is a road. This white area is settlement. And the RGB composite that this is in has the near infrared band in green. So green reflects highly. And this is a pixel value in a vegetated, it's vegetation of some sort. And you can have multiple bands, it doesn't show up extremely well, that can represent different layers of information all about that one particular pixel, one particular spot on the ground. Everybody cool with that? So, yeah. So let's look at Mashi. So here's SEC. This is the Botswana study region, and this is the Namibian region. And since Namibia is where we flew the drone this past field season, it's where I want to focus. The underlying image that you're looking at is Landsat. It's just in a natural color composite. And you can see very clearly the road delineations, the settlement and agriculture along the roads, and then a bunch of green stuff that represents this variation in tree grass ratio across more natural areas in the Conservancy. And the red squares represent where flights got flown. So we did approximately 60 flights, 60 samples across the area, again stratified and randomly generated, and then balanced with accessibility and timing. Depends on the product you're talking about. Yeah, no. I mean, so I'm going to show you. Actually, I have some slides that are going to show you. But it does vary. It does depend on whether it's the drone or whether it's Rapid Eye or Landsat or MODIS. It changes the number of pixels that are going to be in that 200 by 200 extent. And I'll demonstrate that right now. So if we look at oh, and I just put these up. Those were the land use resource areas. So you can, and about a third of our flights wound up overlapping with resource areas, which is interesting and hopefully useful. I'll let you know later how useful that winds up being. But this is going to demonstrate it for you. So this is okay. So this example here is just showing you the difference in spatial resolution between products. Then I'm going to show you the difference in the products relative to one of those flights. This is if you were to open up the Esri base map in ArcGIS or comparably Google Earth and zoom in pretty darn far. And you can see what's really easy to identify. Trees, right? It's really easy to differentiate. You can see the trees. You can probably even sit here and digitize the tree crowns if you really wanted to spend your time doing that. Landsat is 30-meter spatial resolution, which means that each grid cell is 30 by 30 meters. Versus if you can't see them, but if you were to zoom way in, this is around 5 meters, I think. I can actually find that actual value. 30-meter resolution for Landsat, 5-meter resolution for Rapid Eye. And so so this is the same area, right? So if you want, you could focus on the tree cover up here, or you could focus on the bare area with the trees around here, or something to give your eye something to adjust to across scales. And you're going to see a shift in the color variation between pixels, which is representative of the reflectance characteristics across these different land cover types. You start seeing with the Rapid Eye a pattern that's starting to look a little bit more reminiscent of what that original spatial resolution was. And then this is the data from the drone. So the drone is 10 centimeter resolution in terms of those individual pixels, and is incredibly high spatial fidelity in terms of differentiating trees and grass. And what we're also hoping to differentiate is tree height. So that structure, differentiating the structure. So going back to that idea that the trees versus shrubs is really important in terms of characterizing the resource intensity and productivity on this landscape. What does this look like in practice? So this is our ortho photo of one of our flights flown that has the road has one road cut straight through the overall flight path, and then the transition to Rapid Eye to Landsat. And so what we want to do is to build a model that allows us to take information for those areas where we were able to fly the drone and extrapolate and predict outward past the spatial extent of where we have that data. And this is something that we're doing right now. I don't actually have the answer or the analysis for you to present today, but is where we're going. So the flight that we did is just south of of Sochona, which is one of the major village areas in Mashi. And what it looks like is in sort of the process for the drone processing is we created, we used Pix4D and DJI. We had both of those apps on phones, and you basically design a flight plan. We did a double grid plan to make sure we got enough overlap between photos. Each white point on that image represents a photo that was taken by the drone when it was up in the air. The drone had its own sensor, own RGB sensor, plus we had the Sequoia sensor. And so we were collecting a lot of different, or collecting 2 different sets of information. These different points then can get pulled into the software, and we can start looking at build a point cloud in terms of the points that are generated from those photos. And that point cloud is going to inform. So this is showing you, this is just a screen grab from the software. This is showing you the different photos and how they're aligned relative to that point cloud density that can be generated. And there's various parameter settings that you have to identify and decide on relative to the terrain that you're mapping and the height you're mapping, so on and so forth. But the idea is to come up with a mosaic of the landscape that then is representative of the structure and characteristics of the landscape that you just mapped at 100-meter altitude versus space, right? And so this is the orthomosaic from that particular sample from the drone imagery, 10-centimeter resolution. And so now we are going. What we're doing with this data is we want to be able to look at that vegetation structure, which means that we need to differentiate the vegetation from the surface so that we can look at the height structure and the differences in the height for the different types of woody vegetation on the landscape. What's really nice about the Parrot Sequoia sensor, which is why it was attached to the Mavic in the first place, is that for vegetation analyses with remote sensing, it's super helpful if you have infrared sensors to analyze the landscape with, because vegetation reflects very highly in the infrared, and we can look at things like NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, the difference between the infrared and the red bands shown here. That's going to allow vegetation to pop in green, which is shown here. The other thing that we can kick out from the analysis of the drone data in Pix4D is a digital surface model. So this is the output in its raw form. That again in the I apologize, there's not a legend on here. In the darker tone colors is the higher structured vegetation in the landscape. All right, and you can subtract this from a digital terrain model, all right, so that you can just isolate vegetation heights. And I put this in a transparency, hopefully so that you could see the imagery underneath it, but I'm not sure how well you can do that. But I'll show you a better photo in a second. So this canopy height model is what we're then using to feed in to actually generate our values, that information about vegetation structure that then is going to go back to informing the exposure term in the vulnerability model. And so this is where we're at. We're experimenting with different softwares, with different ways of doing this. This is an example of delineating individual tree crowns using an R package to do that in comparison and contrast. This is using the NV LiDAR software. So it's another approach towards doing the same thing, but there's pros and cons of the different softwares, pros and cons of the different approaches that we're still sussing out and rationalizing for the approach forward. But at the end of the day, what is this? One of the things that this can be doing for us, this is just showing you in the software itself, looking at the actual orthomosaic and identifying where the different vegetation is. But from the analysis in these softwares can come information like this. So these points represent trees, right? And not only do they just say, is there a tree on the landscape, they say, what's the height of that tree? And so we can start, so over here, 3 meters or less is considered not a tree by definition of the way that we've categorized the landscape. Anything that's higher than 3 is so this is basically a woodland, right? This is versus a shrubland versus something else. And so we can take this information and extrapolate it out and use it to inform that larger model. That's the intention anyway. And so here it is overlaid with the orthomosaic of the drone underneath. Here's the data overlaid with the rapid eye, so the 5-meter spatial resolution data. And you can kind of see how it relates. The darker shades of the rapid eye is going to relate to the more dense canopy, higher tree areas on the ground. And here it is with the Landsat data, going up to that 30-meter resolution. So we're currently in the process of seeing how these different resolutions relate to one another and whether or not we can, not whether or not, but how well we can build a model that can characterize and extrapolate from this data. So in summary, I mean, the overall project, bigger picture focus is on vulnerability, household vulnerability, and how that varies across countries for this transboundary area in Southern Africa. We think that the structural equation modeling approach with these is a really good framework, statistical framework for this, because it allows us to have a theoretical platform for identifying how vulnerability is related to exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. But it most importantly gives us a means for quantifying that theoretical framing through these measured indicators that each of these latent constructs is predicted of or correlated to. And so that's where we're going, and that's sort of the project in a nutshell. And if anybody has any other questions, I'd be happy to field them. Thank you. Yeah. Everything but the drone data exists over time, but it's not necessarily just over time, but over space that we're interested in. But over time, the rapid eye goes back to 2000, Landsat goes back to 70s, MODIS back to 2000s, which I didn't illustrate here, but it's another potential platform slash sensor. Ooh. So the household data is not. The household data is one point in time. The exposure term and whether or not there's longitudinal data in there, I think on some level, yes, in terms of characterizing certain aspects of environmental variability, but decisions on that has not been made yet. Yeah. Right. No, so that's an extremely good point. And I didn't go into other details that I probably could. In terms of, I think, defining what degradation is and having something to compare it to in terms of understanding what the degraded state is and to what degree it is, and looking at those deviations from that expected are all part of what will inform the exposure term. And so the decision that we're grappling with right now is how to move forward to do that. That's a good point. Yeah.
Much of their diet still comes from native fauna and flora.
How much of their diet still comes from fauna and flora? It depends on it depends. It depends on the household and depends on just how poor that household is and the types of resources they have. But I think that's one thing that our data is going to be able to suss out based on the sample that we have, because there's questions in there that ask about that very thing. Some people are highly reliant, to be a little more specific. Some people are not. Some households, whatever they can get from the land is how they subsist. Other households, they might have family members that are able to go work in mines or work in the tourism industry or go work in the city and send remittances back. So it just depends. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific than that.
Are the populations growing, and is that what you touched on?
Yes. So that is a huge part of it. And actually some of the folks that I met with over lunch, I got a little too excited and wound up doing a whole map on the whiteboard for them to show just what was going on in the area. And it's a Transfrontier conservation area that has some really interesting dynamics in terms of conservation and development. And so you have, there we go. You have this part of Namibia where there's a lot of population growth, but that's also the central area for wildlife to move between corridors. And so there is a lot of discussion and a lot of conversation about how to balance the growing population, because the growing population is subsequently increasing settlement in agricultural lands, which is eating up the natural corridor areas that vegetation would, or that animals would move through. And potentially increasing human-wildlife conflict.
Why were some of you grown
Accessibility. The sampling frame, accessibility, and the intention of making sure samples related to a gradient of land use intensity. So we intentionally wanted some of them. The sampling framework was designed from village centers and looking at buffering zones away from the village centers, 1, 2, 3 kilometers, and then sampling within those buffers to make sure that we could access that transition, that gradient of land use activity. So that's why, but it can be an extremely hard landscape to navigate, period. You need a 4x4 to go. And if there's not a road to get into somewhere, then it's really hard to access it.
You mentioned the measure of degradation as the quantifying exposure. What are some of the other, a lot of boxes, what are some examples of other parts of the measures for not just exposure, but also adaptive?
So the way that we've theorized it is this idea of capitals right now would inform the adaptive capacity component, and capitals relate to financial capital, social capital. So how connected is that household? What is the kind of incomes that that household has? What are the resources that that household engages or relies on? Sensitivity might be, or is currently the way that we are all agreed on moving forward with. They're measured by indicators related to, say, proportion of crop yield or proportion of livestock. Vulnerability, we have a suite of questions related to food security that is going to probably be our main indicator of vulnerability. We tried to do health-related measures, but initial analysis of the data, we're not seeing enough variability in it to say anything. Oh, that's such a good question. I know. I was like, I'm going to go talk to a bunch of soil scientists, and there's not a soil scientist on this group.
Is there underlying soil mapping data at all? Is that part of that?
There's ISRIC data. I guess I should ask you all how you feel about that data. The Southern Africa, no, there's not very good data, is the short answer. The longer answer is there's some variability. Most of this is nutrient poor, sandy soils that cover the majority of this landscape as part of the Kalahari system. But that variability that does exist there is important because you have variability in the composition of the vegetation as a function of that change. But there is no soil scientist on our team. But if you have any ideas or suggestions or things that we should be thinking about, I would be happy to listen. Right. Well, let me rephrase that. If you guys know of any data sources that would be useful for us to investigate, then I am all ears. Yeah. So this is a system, well, I'll speak specifically to the part of the system that I'm most familiar with, which is Namibia, which is I've been visiting since 2006. And I know it well enough to be able to say that it's not shifting agriculture type of activity. People might have more than one plot, and they might leave one fallow for a few years. But usually once an area has been cleared, it's not I don't think that it's being like abandoned and left for a long period of time. I also know there's a lot of new initiatives with conservation agriculture and other types of engagement to try to help people with alternative types of crops. This is a system that's highly reliant on maize and then sorghum and millet, and the planting of those three primary crops is tied strongly to perceptions of rainfall variability in a given year. And so people will make decisions between the variability that they perceive in the rainfall with their knowledge of the soil nutrients across their plots. And they'll choose to either shift their whole crop into one type of production. So if they think it's a bad rainfall year, they might do sorghum or millet. If they want to hedge their bets, they might do half maize, half, because maize is going to have a higher economic return. Maize and millet are more subsistence tied. The climate component I didn't talk a lot about in this particular presentation, but it's a really fascinating one because this is a system that the rainfall is projected to be declining on average, but also becoming more erratic, more extremes. And so it's a huge influence on the rainfall in this region. So when El Nino comes, it exacerbates the dry conditions, and when La Nina comes, it exacerbates the wet conditions. So it's really, and then you have a shift that people are seeing, and that I think is also reflected in the data on the timing of the rainfall. So when I first started working there, people talked about the rains in October, and now what's happening is people are really hesitant to plant with the first rains because that's not indicative of the rainy season. There might be a 2 or 3 week dry spell that totally ruins that effort. And so people are waiting until late November before they're actually planting. No. I mean, there might be some irrigation in some areas, especially closer on the eastern side in Namibia. I don't know about Zambia. Talk about Namibia, and it's this whole area. And in Botswana, there are some. Every single question you ask has been, it sort of depends. But by and large, especially with the community areas that we're engaged with, it's rural subsistence-based, rain-fed type of agriculture.
It's kind of like our south.
Yeah.
Very narrow.
Right. Yeah. This is a higher rainfall area. The area where the data was collected is 400 to 600 millimeters per year.
That's one of the original. Do you get a sense from the locals that they strong supportive of that?
So, I mean, I don't think at the local level it appeals very much because that was a source of revenue. Now, how that's going to impact them is really interesting. And I was telling the folks at lunch, I really appreciate you guys letting me just yammer on about this because I really enjoy talking about it. But Botswana in those communities are a little bit better off than Namibia or the Zambian context, which provides a really interesting comparison context for us with our project. So whether or not that hunting ban actually has a negative impact on them, I don't know. I don't know if their livelihoods are diversified enough that the revenue from hunting doesn't impact them, then it won't be a negative. But if it was a really high source of reliant funds, then you might see something. Zimbabwe was originally in our proposal.